Hey, River Church, it's Tim. I'm here at Ben's Beans. We're continuing in our family devotional series. Today's a big one because this is the 10th one. We're hitting double digits. And so if you've been with me for the whole ride, you know that we've made a good chunk into Philippians, but we still have quite a ways to go. So as usual, I'm hoping that you've already had time to read through the passage we're working on. In case you need a refresher, you can go ahead and pause and look through it. We're going to be in Philippians 2, 12 to 18. Now, we've been using a 4-step process. Again, I'll reiterate, the first step is to understand what the author intended for the original audience. So in Philippians, we're trying to understand, what did Paul mean to the church in Philippi? Second, we're examining differences in culture between present and the biblical audiences. What is different between us today and the church in Philippi? Which, in this case, is thankfully minimal. Third, what is the theological principle in this text? What is the big idea? And then fourth, how should this be applied to our lives? This is a process that helps us from jumping straight to 4. How should this be applied? By understanding first, what is God saying? So, again, if you haven't read, please go back. I'd love if you can follow through those 4 steps the best you can, see what you can dig out before jumping into application. I do have a couple things I'd like to discuss. I was actually a little bit optimistic. I was hoping we could go through a couple of more tools, and we should have time for 1 or 2. But this is a key part in the book of Philippians. What's happening here is the end of the exhortation section, at least this part, where Paul's not going to be telling the church in Philippi how to correct their behavior. So what has happened so far, it has begun back in roughly in 1, whether it was 19 or it was a little bit later in 27, he started to challenge the church in Philippi. The proof text, the theme of the entire book of Philippians was found in 1:21. To live is Christ, to die is gain. But then in 1:27, which is where we're pointing back to briefly, he said, Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. This is roughly where he began his exhortation, his challenging section. So first things first, this passage clearly points back to 1:27. In fact, in the very beginning of it, he talks about how in his absence, they're continuing to obey, where back in 1:27, he was talking about their obedience to the gospel. But further, in 1:27, he set the groundwork. He presented that the rest of the text, the exhortation section, where it goes into some specifics, some nitty-gritty, some very practical daily living advice, it all points back to 1:27, where he says, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. Well, it also points back to 2:8, Philippians 2:8, where we had just talked about it last week. There was this Christ hymn, a song of worship to Jesus just a few decades after he came. Now, the significant section here is in chapter 2, verse 8. It says that he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. It's hard to separate the Christ-like obedience from the obedience to be like Christ a couple verses later. But this is extreme. This is big Christ obedience, to be able to obey to the point of death on the cross, in ultimate humility. The third place where it points back to is, as I'd mentioned earlier, the proof text in Philippians 1:21. It says, to live is Christ. And so this reference of obedience, which we're going to dig a little bit more into when he talks about work out your own salvation, this points back to, what is it to live as Christ would have you, or to make your life dedicated to Christ. This is radical obedience. This is obedience that Christ has shown, but that we as Christians strive and desire to attain. So, here comes this interesting section. The passage we're going over is Philippians 2:12-18. Really, the only part that needs any work is 12 and 13. Verses 14 to 18, there's no gap. I mean, for all we know, this could be something that is just sent from Pastor Josh to River Church. This is directly applicable. So what we're going to try to work on is the little area that's maybe a little bit dark, maybe a little bit difficult to understand, and we're going to shed a little light on it and work through it. The most troublesome area is this phrase, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. In all of Paul's writing, in all of the New Testament, it is abundantly clear that you do not earn your salvation. There is nothing that Paul has ever said that affirms working out to earn salvation. It further later says that it is God who works out in you. But there's this term, this work out your own salvation. So I did a little digging, worked into the Greek. The Greek term here is katergatsathe. This is a term that's rooted in an idea of bringing or producing. So what I did, and I'd love to teach you how to do as well, without any Greek knowledge, is how to do a word study. So what I did is I use a tool. It's a Blue Letter Bible. It's a quickly accessed resource. I typically use Logos, which is a Bible software, but it costs money, and Blue Letter Bible's free. And for the sake of this, I really want to see if this free resource would be useful enough for a word study, and sure enough it was. So what I did is I searched in the verse I wanted to work on. It's going to be this Philippians 2:12. And so when I went there, you can kind of break it down. It's a term called interlinear. This would be, if you had an interlinear Bible, it would have an English translation next to the original Greek. And so in this case, it breaks it down so that you can find the word you're interested in. So I scroll down. It had it here, and then there's this little section that has a G and a number. What that is a link. It's almost like a dictionary entry. It's in a Strong's Concordance. It's this universalized kind of assembly of all the different Greek or Hebrew words. It's all found in this one huge book. Well, luckily it's all online and it's free and easy to access. If you click it, it shows you the root word and how it's used in different locations. And so the fruit of some of that I wanted to kind of break down. So the first I had was all in Romans, was Romans 4:15. It says, for the law brings wrath. In Romans 5:3 it says, knowing that suffering produces endurance. And then Romans 7:8 says, but sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. What was interesting is this particular time, the Greek word was plural. This is significant because in the three examples I just gave, it was singular. It was the law brings wrath. Suffering produces endurance. What's different here is it's now plural. So I pulled up the only two other examples were in Ephesians 6:13, where it uses it plural, and then Romans 1:27, where it's used plural. The Ephesians example is referencing the armor of God, and after having put on the armor of God. And then Romans 1:27 is reference to men and women committing sinful acts. Both of these have the nouns are plural. So now when we look back, we got to break down what is this phrasing. So we can supply a word. So when it says work out your own salvation, if we supply the word you, work out your own salvation, then we've got two sides. One of them has to be plural. Is it you, or is it the working out of your own salvation? It honestly has to be the you, the noun. In order for that to maintain plurality, we have to see that when he's talking to you, he's not talking to an individual. He's saying you as people. You as a community, you as the capital C church, work out your own salvation. So this isn't to say that we're to earn anything. It's not possible. Nothing we could ever do would be good enough to earn our own salvation. What it does mean is that we as a church have a responsibility. Let's go back to 127. It says, only let your life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. This idea is that as a church, we should be working together. That we shouldn't be striving on our own, but that we should be seeking harmony within our church so that we can advance together. Now, the challenge here is to read through the rest, and I'll let you do this on your own, but read through the rest of this exhortation passage. I would say go back to 1:21, maybe even back all the way to 19, and then finish through 2:18, understanding that what he's saying is that you as a church body, you as the capital C church, the body of Christ, that you work out your salvation. For it is God who works in you. Now, this is a little bit tricky, but at the end of the day, the message is clear. Paul wants the gospel to advance by a community that is advancing together. People are coming together in unity. He even says back in the early part of 2, he says, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, and being of full accord of one mind. Ultimately, being united. And all this serves to advance the gospel. Because at the end of the day, that's what matters. The gospel is the core to everything. We are obedient because of the gospel, because of what Christ has done. Now, for application, this is easy. This is simple. It's written very plainly. What is it to work out our salvation, to be the gospel? It's to do all things without grumbling or disputing. It's to be together so that likewise we should be glad and rejoice just as Paul rejoiced. All right, River Church, that's all I've got for today. A lot of this is stuff you can work through. I only really wanted to help with a couple of areas, and it's really that key word, that bringing, that working out, that producing, and then also a couple of the key connections. But if you've got any questions, feel free to give me a call. If you are interested in doing a word study of your own, give me a call. I'll walk you through how to do it the first time. It's a very valuable tool. It's not useful every time, but sometimes, like this, it can produce a lot of helpful insight. We can see things a little bit differently. My number is 774-200-5279. Feel free to text me, give me a call, and we can work through it together. Next week, we're going to be actually in a little bit of a shorter section. We're going to be in 2:19-24. This is just talking about Paul and Timothy and what he has to say about Timothy. After that, we're going to talk about Epaphroditus. If you recall, we talked about Epaphroditus like 2 months ago and haven't really been able to talk about him since. But this is going to be one of the first times we're going to see him again. And so we're going to address that in a separate lesson 2 weeks from now. If you are doing the memory verses, this week's memory verse is really going to be depending on what you're interested in. For kind of the big picture, the idea is really verses 2 to 13. It's a longer text. This can be really useful because at the end of the day, it's the idea of working out our salvation. Isn't that something you want locked in? The other one, and it's much shorter, much more accessible, especially if you're doing this with children. This is going to be really directly applicable. It's Philippians 2:14. It says, do all things without grumbling or disputing. It's nice, it's palatable, and it's really readily applicable. All right, River Church. Well, I appreciate your time. Again, if you have any feedback, feel free to let me know. Call me, whatever, text me, and we can talk through it all. Hey, have a great week. I'll see you next week.